Guys, so I come to you to talk about Friedrich Nietzsche by Cate. This is a biography of the eponymous man, which was published in 2005. First biography of Nietzsche that I have read. I have read a few books by Nietzsche, and when you get interested in a thinker who's as monumentally important as he is, you eventually get interested in reading about his life. And this is a story of his life, the events of his life, but it's also a story of his ideas. So that was also very helpful in getting a sort of macroscopic view of Nietzsche's thought. So for anyone who doesn't know, Friedrich Nietzsche was a philosopher who was born in 1844, died in 1900. He was German, born in Germany, but lived much of his life in Switzerland and Italy and other places. As a young boy, he was actually deeply religious. He was actually the son of a Lutheran pastor, and his family, when he was young, expected that he would become a pastor himself. But in his adolescence and young adulthood, he lost his faith, and much of his thinking and writing in his later years would be fierce critiques of religion. So he did a real 180. But anyway, he was a precocious young guy. He studied philology at university, which is the study of languages, and was appointed as a professor at the University of Basel when he was only 24, so kind of a prodigy almost. And he didn't really like the academic life as a professor. He taught Greek and Roman classics. He taught philosophy. He taught poetry and languages, of course, for about 10 years, but he just grew disillusioned with how pigeonholed you have to become when you go into academia. You have to pick one area to study, one very specialized area, and just study that to death, basically. And he didn't like the idea of pigeonholing himself like that. And he also just thought that the so-called scholars around him were just really closed-minded and not really responsive to his way of thinking, and so when he was in his early 30s, he stopped teaching and basically lived for the rest of his life on a pension. And he just sort of drifted around from place to place, not really holding down a job, but he had a yearly income from an inheritance and from a pension from the university, and that time after he stopped working at the university was when he wrote most of the books that he's most well known for. Spoke Zarathustra, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo. Before I talk anything about Nietzsche's philosophy, he wrote for years. He had a lot of composer friends, writer friends, academic friends. He had a very close and intense relationship with Richard Wagner, the composer, and his wife Cosima Wagner. But anyway, in 1889 he had a horrible breakdown where he basically just went insane, finally. He probably suffered from syphilis, which can cause early onset dementia, and in his case a very early onset. And he basically had the breakdown, and after this breakdown he just was not a functional person anymore. He had to be taken care of by his sister and his mother. He basically had to be spoon-fed by his mother. He couldn't really hold a coherent conversation. He would say insane things. He would be, dancing around naked in his room, all these crazy things. And then he died when he was only in his mid-50s. So, kind of a tumultuous and tragic life, but his thinking has gone on to be incredibly influential, and, summarizing his thinking is incredibly difficult. I'm not gonna pretend to do it any sort of justice in this video. I wouldn't even attempt that, because his thinking is so complex and so hard to pin down, because he wrote in a very elusive style. He deliberately used ambiguous German words that had many different meanings. He was a big fan of wordplay and such, but also he just wrote in such a sort of bombastic literary style, poetic style, that made it really hard to really know what exactly he meant. So there's just a lot to deal with talking about Nietzsche, and there's also the fact that he was also contradicted himself a bunch throughout his writings. He never really organized his own thinking into a coherent system, ever. But the parts of Nietzsche's philosophy that have always been most important to me, and so the way that I see him, his thinking, is that it's all about how to find meaning in a world where you no longer believe in a god. So he saw all the scientific discoveries going on around him, especially, the theory of evolution with Charles Darwin, but others as well, and just saw how these would gradually erode people's belief in traditional religions. And he himself was one of the first prominent atheists. It was starting to become more common to be an atheist in his time, but it still was far from the norm. So, and his writings were filled with fierce critiques of religion and its inadequacies in helping people to find meaning as he saw it. And so his writings could be very scandalous in that sense. But that's how I've always seen the crux of Nietzsche's philosophy. And it usually, the way that he sees the path to finding meaning is through a sort of self-overcoming, through sort of bettering yourself through the sufferings of life. So through sort of embracing the hardships of life, we can better ourselves and become Übermensch is the word, which is often translated as Superman, but that kind of sounds stupid, so I prefer to call it Overman. So that is sort of how I would sort of summarize his thought, but obviously there are a lot of intricacies to it that I can't go into, in which Curtis Cate devotes a lot of space in this biography to. So anyway, moving back to the book itself, and starting with those discussions of Nietzsche's thought, I think that when Curtis Cate is talking about Nietzsche's writing and Nietzsche's thinking, those are the best parts of this book, I think. They're incredibly spirited, they're really accessible, really accessibly written, there's no jargon at all. I feel like in those sections, like, they're probably the ones that Curtis Cate wanted to write, and I feel like they would be helpful for newbies to Nietzsche's philosophy, but also really stimulating for people who maybe have read some Nietzsche, but just need a bit more context, maybe a bit more explanation. And so I really liked that part. I also think that a lot of the biography, although not all of it, is told in a style that sort of feels like how you would expect someone to tell a story when they're telling it around a campfire, which, is just the kind of storytelling that you crave in a nonfiction book, especially when sometimes I think nonfiction writers can forget that they need to actually be good storytellers. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't occasionally get bogged down in details, so I do feel like Curtis Cate can fall into this sort of trap of in his narrative of the events of Nietzsche's life, of saying, oh, he went and did this, and then he went and wrote this, and then he moved here, and then he said this to this person, and then he wrote a letter to here, and this happened. And it's just sort of a rote recitation of the events, without much, stimulating narrative flair to keep you particularly interested in what's going on. And so sometimes it kind of felt like he just assumed he wasn't fighting for you to be interested in the book. He just assumed you were interested in what he was writing about, in those parts when he got boring in that sense. So that was unfortunate. And then my final quibble with the book, and this quibble's sort of divided in two, but I feel like they're a bit related. It's my biggest quibble, and it's, again, not a huge deal. It only comes up a few times, but it did irk me. So the first part of this is that I feel like Curtis Cate would sometimes use Nietzsche's thinking to prop up his own opinions about contemporary issues. So the one example that I remember is when he was talking about the sexual moralities, beliefs surrounding sexuality at the time that Nietzsche was alive. It was the Victorian period. Basically, you were supposed to pretend that sex didn't exist, and so no one was educated about sex in any way, and a lot of people didn't even really know what it was, in a sense. And Nietzsche was fiercely critical of that, and that's all well and good. But Curtis Cate will discuss Nietzsche's critique of that idea and how it's toxic. But then he'll go one step further and say, oh, well, then you can look at in our modern society where we have the exact opposite. Supposedly, according to Curtis Cate, we have the exact opposite, where we have sex education in our schools, and supposedly that is sort of robbing young people of the opportunity to, figure things out for themselves, which Curtis Cate apparently thinks is a valuable experience. And for one thing, I feel like he implies that sex education is bad in that part. But also, it's just like, that's not a biography of Nietzsche. I feel like isn't the place for putting forth your own polemics, I guess. And so that irritated me. That only happened a few times, but still, it did really irritate me. And then the other related issue was that I feel like Critics Gate isn't very critical of Nietzsche's thinking. There were real overtones of misogyny in some of Nietzsche's writings, and Critics Gate even covers those. But he doesn't seem to really argue with them at all. He seems to report them in the same way that he reports all of Nietzsche's other thinking, where universally you get the sense that Critics Gate thinks that all of Nietzsche's thought was pure gold. So you're like, okay, so do you think that him saying that women are dumb and can't understand his ideas is also pure gold? And I think that there are also undercurrents of anti-Semitism in Nietzsche's work that Critics Gate doesn't really engage with, and so that annoyed me. Again, it only happened a couple times, but I feel like it is notable. Yeah, I guess my review at the end of the day is a bit mixed. I'm glad I read this. I feel like I know Nietzsche much better. I have a much more holistic sense of his thought and his body of work. You know, this book definitely was a shot in the arm for me to read more Nietzsche, because I've only read 3 books by him, and I need to probably reread at least 2 of those. And then I need to read more Nietzsche, because I've only read 3 books, and he wrote, like, more than 10. And so, yeah, I feel like I did learn a lot, but I don't know if I would say that this is the place to go if you're looking for a first Nietzsche biography. I know that Sue Prideaux wrote a biography of him a year or 2 ago called I Am Dynamite, which I've heard really good things about. So I might suggest you go there, even though I haven't read it, so I can't exactly recommend that one. But I think if I want to read another Life of Nietzsche, it'll be that one. So anyway, those are my thoughts on this biography. If you have read this book, give me your thoughts. If you have read any of Nietzsche's works, give me your thoughts. If you've read any other biographies of Nietzsche, then give me your thoughts on those biographies. Would you recommend those biographies? Or, if you've read multiple biographies, which ones would you recommend? And yeah, anyway, just any other general thoughts. So, yeah, that's all I have. And anyway, I will talk to you all in my next video. Bye, guys.